I pulled the car up to the curb, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounding like an unwelcome intrusion in the quiet of the early afternoon. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were turning white. For a moment, I just sat there, the engine idling, staring at the house that had once been my sanctuary. Patrick's house, or at least it had been his, once upon a time. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, flanked by tall, swaying pine trees that seemed to whisper secrets to each other in the breeze. The wooden fence surrounding the property had seen better days, its paint peeling and boards leaning precariously in different directions. Ivy climbed over the stone walls, and the garden was a wild tangle of overgrown grass and weeds. It looked as though no one had set foot here in years. My throat tightened as memories washed over me, summers spent running barefoot through the garden, the taste of sweet strawberries fresh off the vine, the sound of Patrick's laugh as he called me in for dinner. It all felt so vivid, like I could reach out and touch those moments, but they were just out of grasp. "Get it together, Lucas," I muttered to myself, taking a deep breath and turning off the engine. The silence that followed was overwhelming, pressing in on me from all sides. I hadn't been back here since I was a teenager. Not since my mother and Patrick had their falling out. Not since we left and never looked back. I grabbed my keys and got out of the car, the door shutting behind me with a dull thud. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and earth. I made my way up the path to the front porch, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The paint on the front door was faded and chipped, a far cry from the bright blue I remembered. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. What was I expecting to find? The house had been empty for years, or so I'd been told. After my mother's death last year, I found the deed and the unpaid tax notices. I had come back to sell the place, to settle debts and move on. But standing here now, I felt a wave of uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Dust particles danced in the beams of light filtering through the grimy windows. The familiar scent of the house, wood polish, must, and something faintly sweet like vanilla, hit me all at once. I felt a lump in my throat. The place felt both abandoned and alive, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to come home. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The hallway stretched before me, lined with old family photos that had faded with time. I paused in front of one, a picture of me and Patrick standing by the lake, his arm draped over my shoulders, both of us smiling. I reached out to touch the frame, my fingers brushing the dust away. "Why did you lie to me, Mom?" I whispered to myself. "Why did you make me believe he didn't care?" I walked into the living room, where Patrick's old armchair still sat by the fireplace. The fabric was worn, the cushions sunken, but it looked like he had just stepped out for a moment. On the small table beside it, a stack of books was neatly piled, a pair of reading glasses perched on top. My heart ached. I had imagined this place to be empty, lifeless. Instead, it felt like Patrick could walk in at any moment. I moved to the kitchen, my fingers trailing over the worn countertop. The kitchen was just as I remembered, with its ancient stove, chipped ceramic sink, and a small wooden table in the corner. It was then that I noticed the loaf of bread on the table. It looked fresh, a jar of jam sitting beside it, and a plate with crumbs. My stomach tightened with unease. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I stepped back into the hallway, listening for any signs of life. Nothing but the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. The house wasn't supposed to be occupied. I made my way to the stairs, peering up into the darkness. The thought of someone being here, someone who wasn't supposed to be, made my heart race. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, then forced myself to take the first step. The wood creaked loudly under my weight, each step echoing in the quiet house. When I reached the top, I paused, listening. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric, coming from one of the rooms. My chest tightened. I moved down the hallway, stopping in front of the door to Patrick's old study. It was slightly ajar. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, there was no response, just the soft ticking of a clock from inside the room. Then the door creaked open wider, and a figure stepped out. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure was tall and thin, his hair a mixture of gray and white, his eyes piercing and familiar. He looked older, more worn, but there was no mistaking who he was. Lucas. The voice was rough but unmistakable, filled with a mixture of surprise and recognition. I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Patrick, I whispered, my voice barely audible, but I thought you were dead. Patrick looked at me for a long moment, his face a mixture of relief and sadness. I'm not dead, Lucas, he said softly, stepping forward. I'm very much alive. I felt the world tilt on its axis. My knees went weak, and I stumbled back, catching myself against the wall. But, Mom said, she told me you were gone, I stammered. Why would she lie? Patrick's face crumpled with sorrow. There's so much you don't know, Lucas, he said, his voice trembling. So much I wanted to tell you, but your mother, she wouldn't let me. She kept you away. I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything. Why? Why would she do that? Patrick reached out, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. Because of what happened with your father. Because of the accident. There are things you don't know, things she was afraid to tell you. I pulled away from his touch, anger bubbling up inside me. You should have told me. I snapped. You should have tried to find me to explain. Patrick looked at me with eyes full of regret. I did try, Lucas. I wrote letters, I called, but your mother always blocked me. I was afraid of making things worse. I was afraid of losing you. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek. I thought you didn't care, I said, my voice breaking. I thought you didn't want me. Patrick's face crumpled, and he pulled me into a hug. I've always wanted you, Lucas, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You were my grandson, my family. I never stopped caring. I stood there in his arms, the weight of years of misunderstanding and anger falling away. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was home. The sun had slipped behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the front yard by the time I finally managed to pull myself away from the house. My mind was reeling, still struggling to comprehend the fact that my grandfather was alive. I needed fresh air, needed to clear my head. I had thought coming back to the village would bring closure, that selling the house would be like closing a chapter of my life I'd long ago left behind. Instead, it felt like I had opened a book filled with more questions than answers. I walked down the path that led from the house to the village center, my feet moving automatically along the familiar route. The trees lining the way seemed to lean in closer than I remembered, their branches reaching out like old friends. As I walked, memories surfaced of Patrick and me taking this path to the market, his hand warm around mine, his deep voice telling me stories about the history of the village, of the people who lived here. The village itself hadn't changed much. It was the same small collection of cottages clustered around the central square, with the church steeple rising above the rooftops, a silent guardian over the lives of the people below. The shops that lined the main street were all familiar. Miller's Bakery, with its windows filled with freshly baked bread, the scent of it wafting out to meet me. The general store, with its creaky wooden floors and shelves crammed with everything from canned goods to handmade trinkets. I rounded a corner and saw Mrs. Thompson's house up ahead. Her cottage was one of the most charming in the village, with a bright blue door and flower boxes overflowing with marigolds and petunias. I remembered spending afternoons in her garden, helping her water the plants while she told me stories about when my grandfather was a boy. As if on cue, the door to Mrs. Thompson's cottage opened, and she stepped out, wiping her hands on a flour-stained apron. She looked older than I remembered, her hair more gray than brown, her face lined with age, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She spotted me immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. "Lucas, is that really you?" she called out, her voice warm and familiar. I managed to smile and waved as I approached. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. It's good to see you." She came down the steps and wrapped me in a tight hug before pulling back to look me over. "Goodness, you've grown. Last time I saw you, you were just a boy. What brings you back to the village after all these years?" I hesitated, not sure how much to say. "I came to take care of some things," I said vaguely. "I needed to see the house, Patrick's house." Her eyes softened at the mention of Patrick's name. "Oh, Lucas, I heard about your mother's passing. I'm so sorry, dear. I know things weren't easy between her and Patrick, but he loved you so much. He's talked about you often over the years." I looked at her, startled. "You've spoken to him? Recently?" Mrs. Thompson frowned, looking confused. "Of course I have. I see him every now and then when he comes into the village for groceries." "Why?" I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. I thought he was dead. Mom told me he was dead. That's why I came back, to sell the house. I didn't know. Mrs. Thompson's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "Oh, Lucas, no. Patrick's been alive this whole time. He's been living in that house, just like always. Your mother told you he was dead." I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and betrayal all over again. She lied to me. All these years she lied, and I believed her. Mrs. Thompson reached out, her hand resting gently on my arm. "Lucas, your grandfather has always cared about you. He asked me about you every time I saw him. He never stopped loving you, even after everything that happened with your parents." I looked down at my feet, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. Why didn't he try to contact me? Why did he do something? Mrs. Thompson's face softened with sympathy. "He did try, Lucas. After you left, he wrote letters, but they were always sent back unopened. He called, but your mother never let him speak to you. Eventually, he stopped, but not because he didn't care. He didn't want to make things harder for you. He thought it would be easier if you didn't know." I swallowed hard, the pain of the years of silence, the belief that my grandfather had abandoned me, cutting deep. "I wish he had tried harder," I said quietly. Mrs. Thompson sighed, shaking her head. "Sometimes we make mistakes, thinking we're protecting the ones we love. Patrick thought he was doing what was best for you, even if it was the wrong decision. But he's always been on your side, Lucas. Always." I felt the flicker of hope at her words, mixed with the ache of loss and misunderstanding. "I need to talk to him," I said, my voice firm. "There are things I need to know, things I need to hear from him." Mrs. Thompson smiled gently. "I think that's a good idea. He's waited a long time for this, Lucas. Don't let any more time slip away. Go to him." I nodded, feeling a new sense of resolve. "I will. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." She patted my arm affectionately. "Go on, dear, and if you need anything, you know where to find me." I gave her a grateful smile and turned to head back up the path to Patrick's house. My heart was pounding in my chest, a mixture of anxiety and determination. There were so many questions, so many pieces of the past that didn't fit together. But one thing was clear. Patrick was alive, and he had always cared. And now, after all these years, I had the chance to find the truth. As I walked back, the village seemed to shift around me, no longer just a relic of my past, but a place where answers waited, where reconciliation was possible. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling my lungs, and quickened my pace. It was time to face the man who had been at the center of my childhood, the man I thought I'd lost forever. It was time to face my grandfather. The walk back to Patrick's house felt longer than before, each step heavy with the weight of revelation. My mind buzzed with unanswered questions and the simmering anger at my mother's betrayal. How could she have lied to me for so many years? And why? I pushed the questions down, telling myself there would be time to unravel those knots later. Right now, I needed to hear Patrick's side of the story. I needed to know the truth. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time I reached the house, casting a twilight glow over the familiar surroundings. The garden was now a dark silhouette, and the ivy-covered walls looked almost black in the fading light. I hesitated at the bottom of the steps, a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. What if Patrick refused to talk? What if there were no answers? I took a deep breath and climbed the steps to the porch, my hand pausing on the door handle. For a moment, I was a child again, nervous and excited to see my grandfather after a long day of exploring the woods. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the open doorway to the living room. I followed it, finding Patrick seated in his armchair by the fireplace, a small fire crackling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Patrick looked up as I entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. He was still the man I remembered, though his shoulders seemed more hunched, his hair more gray. Yet his presence was as strong as ever, a quiet strength that filled the room. "Lucas," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm glad you came back." I nodded, moving to sit on the old sofa across from him. The fire's warmth was comforting, but it did little to ease the tension in my chest. "I talked to Mrs. Thompson," I began, my voice tight. "She told me you've been alive all this time, that you've been living here. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me believe you were dead?" Patrick's face fell, and he stared into the fire for a moment before speaking. "It's not that simple, Lucas. Your mother, she made it clear she didn't want me in your life. After you left, I tried to reach out, but she wouldn't have it. Letters, calls, everything came back. Eventually, I thought, maybe it was better for you if I stayed away." I shook my head, feeling a surge of frustration. How could that possibly be better for me? I grew up thinking you didn't care, that you abandoned me. I needed you, and you were gone. Patrick's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I never wanted to abandon you, Lucas. I loved you more than anything. But your mother was so angry, so afraid. She thought if I stayed in your life, it would only cause more pain." "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why was she so afraid? What happened that made her hate you so much?" Patrick took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for something painful. "It all started with the accident," he said finally. "Your father and mother had been arguing that night. Something about money, about the future. Your mother decided to go for a drive to cool off, but she was upset, distracted. Your father insisted on going with her to calm her down. And then the accident happened. It was your mother who was driving, not your father." The room seemed to tilt, the words echoing in my mind. "Mom was driving," I whispered. "But I thought she always said Dad was behind the wheel." Patrick nodded slowly. "That's the story your father insisted on. He loved her so much, Lucas. He wanted to protect her, no matter the cost. So when the police arrived, he told them he was driving. He took the blame, even though he was innocent." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My father, the man I'd idolized as a child, had sacrificed everything to protect my mother, and she had letting him bear the burden of guilt and punishment. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Why did you let me believe a lie?" Patrick looked at me with deep sadness in his eyes. "Because your mother begged me to keep quiet. She was terrified of losing you, of losing everything. She thought if the truth came out, it would destroy our family. And I didn't want to make things worse. I thought maybe if I stayed out of it, you'd have a chance at a normal life, even if it meant you had to believe I was the bad guy." I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. "So all these years you just sat here knowing the truth and did nothing?" Patrick's voice trembled as he spoke. "Not nothing, Lucas. I tried to write to you, to tell you everything, but your mother always intervened. I'd even thought about going to the police, but your father, he begged me not to. He said it was his choice, and he didn't want to ruin your mother's life. I was caught between wanting to protect you and respecting your father's wishes." I stopped pacing and turned to face him. "Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you fight harder?" Patrick's eyes were filled with regret. "Because I thought you'd be better off without the truth. I didn't want to burden you with the mistakes of the past. But seeing you here now, knowing how much pain my silence has caused, I realize I was wrong. You deserve to know the truth all along. I should have fought harder. I'm sorry, Lucas." I sank back onto the sofa, my head in my hands. The weight of the revelations was crushing, my mind struggling to process it all. Everything I had believed about my family, about my childhood, was unraveling before me. After a long silence, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do now? How do I make sense of all this?" Patrick leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Lucas. But know this, your father made his choices out of love. Your mother was scared, but she loved you in her own way. And I never stopped loving you. We'd all made mistakes, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. But we have a chance now, a chance to start over, to mend what's been broken." I looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the hope. How? I asked, my voice cracking. How do we fix this? Patrick reached out, taking my hand in his. We start by forgiving each other, he said softly, and we go from there, one step at a time. I sat there, the fire's warmth seeping into my bones, Patrick's hand in mine. The truth had been painful to hear, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild the relationship we had lost. As the fire crackled softly, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows of Patrick's kitchen, casting golden patches on the worn wooden floor. I had barely slept the night before, my mind too full of everything Patrick had told me. My grandfather moved around the kitchen with an ease that came from years of habit, brewing coffee and preparing a simple breakfast of toast and eggs. I watched him, trying to reconcile the man before me with the memories I had clung to for so long. He seemed older, more fragile, but there was still a steadiness to him, a quiet strength. Eat something, Lucas, Patrick said gently, setting a steaming mug of coffee in front of me. You've got that look on your face, the same one you had when you were a boy, whenever something was bothering you. I managed a faint smile and picked up the mug, taking a sip. The coffee was strong, just the way I liked it. I still don't understand everything. It's hard to wrap my head around the fact that Mom lied about so much, and Dad, I wish I could talk to him, ask him why he made the choices he did. Patrick sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. Your father loved you and your mother more than anything. He did what he thought was right, even if it meant sacrificing himself. But I know there's still so much you don't understand, Lucas, and I think there's someone else who might be able to help fill in the gaps. I looked at him, surprised. Who? Patrick hesitated for a moment before answering. Tom Jenkins. He's been our neighbor for years, ever since before you were born. He was close to your parents. After the accident, he was one of the few people who knew the truth. Your father confided in him, asked him to keep an eye on things. Tom Jenkins? I repeated, trying to recall the face that went with the name. A memory surfaced, an older man with a kind smile and a laugh that rumbled like a freight train. He had always given me a piece of candy when I saw him. He's still around. Patrick nodded. He's been living in the same house for the past 30 years. If anyone knows the full story, it's him. I set my coffee down, a sense of determination settling over me. I need to talk to him. I need to hear his side of things. Patrick stood up, a small smile on his face. I'll take you there. Tom's an early riser. He'll be up by now. The walk to Tom Jenkins' house was short, just a few doors down from Patrick's. As we approached, I felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach. What if Tom refused to talk? What if he didn't want to get involved? Patrick knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet morning air. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing the familiar figure of Tom Jenkins. He hadn't changed much. His hair was completely white now, and his face was more lined, but his eyes were still sharp, and his smile was as warm as I remembered. Patrick, he greeted, his voice still carrying that deep rumble. And Lucas, by God, is that you? I'd heard you were back in town. I nodded, feeling a rush of emotion at seeing him again. Hi, Tom. It's good to see you. Tom stepped back, holding the door open. Come on in, both of you. No sense standing out there like strangers. We followed him inside, and Tom led us to the living room. The space was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with books and knickknacks. Pictures of Tom's family were scattered around, and a large fireplace dominated one wall. Tom motioned for us to sit, and he settled into an armchair across from us. Patrick told me a little about why you're here, Lucas, Tom said, his voice gentle. I know you've got a lot of questions. If I can help, I will. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Tom, Patrick told me about the accident, about my father taking the blame for something he didn't do. I don't understand why. Why would he do that? Why would he let himself go to prison for something he wasn't guilty of? Tom sighed, his expression turning serious. Your father, Liam, was a good man, Lucas. He loved your mother, Aurora, more than anything. When the accident happened, she was in no state to handle the consequences. She was driving too fast, upset, and lost control. Your father knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy her. She faced legal trouble, and the scandal would follow her and you forever. He didn't want that for his family, so he made a choice. I shook my head, trying to understand. But what about me? What about what I needed? Didn't he think about how it would affect his own son? Tom leaned forward, his eyes full of empathy. He did think about you, Lucas. Every day he spent in prison, he thought about you. But in his mind, he was protecting you from something worse. He thought by taking the blame, he was keeping your family together, giving you a chance at a normal life. He believed it was the only way. I felt a lump form in my throat. And my mother? Did she really let him do it? Did she really let him go to prison for her? Tom's face softened. Your mother was scared, Lucas. She was terrified of losing everything, her freedom, her reputation, her family. She loved your father and she loved you, but fear can make people do things they never thought they were capable of. After Liam took the blame, she tried to carry on, to pretend like everything was normal, but it took its toll on her too. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. And you, Tom? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you try to stop them? Tom's expression was pained. I tried to talk to Liam, tried to convince him to tell the truth, but he was adamant. He made me promise not to interfere, said it was his decision, and he didn't want anyone else getting involved. I respected his wishes, but I've regretted it ever since. I've watched you grow up without your father, believing he'd abandoned you, and it's haunted me. I sat back, absorbing his words. The weight of my father's sacrifice, my mother's fear, and Tom's helplessness settled over me like a blanket. So, what now? I asked quietly. What am I supposed to do with all of this? Tom looked at me with kind eyes. That's up to you, Lucas. You can't change the past, but you can decide how you want to move forward. You can find it in your heart to forgive your parents for their mistakes. You can choose to rebuild your relationship with Patrick. The important thing is not to let these secrets keep you from finding peace. Patrick reached over, placing a hand on my shoulder. We can't undo what's been done, Lucas, he said softly. But we can start fresh. We can be the family we were always meant to be. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of resolve. The truth had been painful to hear, but it was out now, no longer a dark shadow hanging over my life. Thank you, Tom, I said, meeting his gaze. Thank you for telling me the truth. I think I know what I need to do. Tom smiled, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I'm glad, Lucas. Your father would want you to find your way to find happiness, and you got people here who care about you, who want to help you do that. As we stood to leave, Tom pulled me into a hug, his embrace warm and reassuring. Take care of yourself, Lucas, and remember, you're not alone. I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of clarity. There were still wounds to heal, still difficult conversations to be had, but I wasn't facing them alone. I had Patrick, and I had the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding the life I thought I had lost. I spent the rest of the day at Patrick's house, the air between us now filled with unspoken questions and a fragile sense of hope. We talked, not about the past, but about everyday things, the weather, the state of the garden, even a little about the neighbors. It felt good to sit with him, to share space without the shadow of secrets looming over us. By evening, however, the weight of everything I had learned began to press down on me again. I felt the need to be alone to think. Grandpa, I'm going to head up to my old room, I said, standing up from the kitchen table where we had been playing a game of cards. The familiarity of it all brought a small smile to my face. I just need some time to process everything. Patrick nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need, Lucas, and if you want to talk, I'm here. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling each creak of the old wood beneath my feet. My childhood room was just as I remembered it, small, with a single bed against the wall, a desk piled with old books, and a window that overlooked the garden. The walls were still decorated with posters of my favorite bands and sports teams, yellowed at the edges from years gone by. I sat on the bed, the springs creaking softly under my weight, and closed my eyes, letting my mind drift back to the memories of my father. His laugh echoed in my ears, the way he used to ruffle my hair, his warm smile. I had always idolized him, seeing him as the strongest man in the world, learning about his sacrifice, his choice to go to prison for something he didn't do, only made my heart ache more. I wished I could tell him how much I understood now, how much I loved him for what he had done, even if it had hurt me. Feeling a sudden urge to reconnect with him in some way, I got up and began to search the room. I pulled open the drawers of my old desk, rummaged through the boxes on the floor. There had to be something, an old letter, a photo, anything that would give me a sense of him, of his thoughts. After a few minutes, my hand brushed against something tucked away in the corner of one of the drawers. It was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and faded. I pulled it out, my heart beating faster. I opened it, flipping through the pages. Most were filled with scribbles, half-written poems, and notes from when I was a teenager. But near the back, I found a folded piece of paper that hadn't yellowed as much as the rest. I carefully unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words written in my father's familiar handwriting. Dear Lucas, I've thought about writing this letter 1,000 times, and each time I put the pen down because I didn't know how to say what I wanted to say. But I can't keep silent anymore. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you a long time ago. First of all, I need you to understand that everything I've done, I did for you and your mother. I know it must be hard to believe, and I can only imagine the pain you felt, thinking I abandoned you, but that was never my intention. I love you, Lucas, more than anything in this world. When I made the decision to take the blame for the accident, I thought it was the best way to protect you. You see, your mother was. The letter cut off there, as if my father had been interrupted mid-sentence. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. He had tried to tell me. He had wanted to explain everything, but something had stopped him. I folded the letter carefully, my mind reeling with the implications. What had he been about to say? What more was there that I didn't know? I rushed downstairs, clutching the letter in my hand. Patrick was still in the kitchen, reading a book. He looked up as I entered, concern crossing his face. Lucas, what is it? I held out the letter. I found this in my old room. It's from Dad. He was trying to tell me the truth. There's more, but it's unfinished. Do you know what he meant? Patrick took the letter, reading the words carefully. His face paled as he reached the unfinished sentence. He set the letter down on the table, his hands trembling slightly. Your father, he was trying to tell you about the accident, about why he did what he did. But there's something else, something he never got the chance to explain. What is it, Grandpa? I asked, leaning forward, desperate for answers. Patrick sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. Your father, he had planned to come forward, to tell the truth about the accident. He couldn't bear the weight of the lie any longer. He wanted to clear his name, to make things right. He was going to meet with a lawyer to figure out how to handle things, but he never made it. The day he was supposed to meet the lawyer, he had a heart attack. He died before he could change anything. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. He was going to tell the truth. I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. He was going to come back to us. Patrick nodded, his own eyes glistening. Yes, Lucas. He was ready to face the consequences, to be honest with you and your mother, but fate had other plans. I'm so sorry. I sank into a chair, the weight of it all crashing down on me. My father had been trapped by his own choices, by the love and loyalty that had led him to protect my mother. And when he had finally decided to break free, to do the right thing, he had been taken from us. The letter was his last attempt to reach out, to make amends. What do I do now? I asked, my voice breaking. How do I make sense of this? Patrick came around the table, kneeling in front of me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. You keep going, Lucas. You hold on to the love your father had for you, the sacrifices he made. You take this truth and use it to heal, not to hurt. You have a chance to break the cycle, to be honest about what's happened, and to rebuild the connections that were lost. I nodded, feeling the tears spill over. I wish I could have told him that I understand now, that I love him. Patrick's eyes softened. He knew, Lucas. He always knew. And he loved you too, more than anything. We sat there in silence for a long time, the fire crackling softly in the background. I held the letter close, feeling a strange sense of peace. The truth was out now, incomplete though it might be. It was up to me to decide what to do with it, to choose whether to let it break me or make me stronger. I thought of my father, of his love and his sacrifice, and I knew what I had to do. I'll talk to Mom, I said finally, my voice steady. I'll tell her I know the truth. Maybe we can start healing too. Patrick smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. I believe in you, Lucas. You're stronger than you know. As the night closed in around us, I felt the weight of the past begin to lift. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could see a path forward. And I knew, whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing it alone.